Jack Thompson had always been a lonely man. In his early 30s, he had spent most of his life as a wandering cowboy, moving from one town to the next. The only constant in his life was his horse, Dusty, and the wide-open plains that stretched as far as the eye could see. Jack had no family to speak of, no friends who stayed in one place long enough to form any lasting bonds, and no real connections to the world around him. His life had always been about moving on, never looking back. It wasn't that Jack disliked people, but after years of working cattle drives and spending nights alone under the stars, he had become accustomed to solitude. The loneliness didn't bother him as much as it once had, but it had also led him to dream of something different, something more stable. A life where he could settle down, where he wouldn't have to move every few months, always chasing after the next job or the next paycheck. One evening, while sitting around the campfire after a long day of cattle herding, Jack's mind wandered to a thought he had recently heard about in a small town he had passed through. There was talk of a ranch for sale in the Southwest, an isolated piece of land that could be bought for a mere $50. At first, Jack had dismissed the idea as too good to be true. He knew the land out there was rugged and unforgiving, and owning a ranch was no simple matter, but the more he thought about it, the more appealing the idea became. What if he could finally settle down, own a piece of land, and start a new chapter in his life? The thought gnawed at him over the following days. Every time he passed another dusty town or came across another broken-down homestead, he found himself thinking about that ranch. What if it really was for sale? What if $50 could actually buy him the chance to have his own home, his own place to be? Jack didn't know how to get in touch with the owner of the ranch, but he wasn't one to back down from a challenge. He had heard that the land was located somewhere near a small desert town, so he made his way there hoping to find more information. The town was dusty and quiet, the kind of place where time seemed to move slowly, and the people spoke with a certain kind of heaviness in their voices, as if the weight of the land was always on their minds. Jack asked around for a few days, but no one seemed to know much about the ranch for sale. Then one morning, as he walked through the town's general store, he overheard a conversation between two men. They were talking about the very ranch Jack had been seeking. "The old ranch, eh?" one man was saying. "I heard it's been sitting empty for years now. No one's bothered with it for a long time." "Yeah," the other man replied. "I think the owner tried to sell it, but nobody was interested. The land's rough, too wild for most folks. I bet the price is dirt cheap, though. You might be able to buy it for just a few dollars." That was all Jack needed to hear. He stepped forward and introduced himself to the men, asking if they knew who owned the ranch. They both scratched their chins and thought for a moment. "I think there's a man in the next town over who has the papers for it," one of the men said. "His name's Walter Thompson. He's an old fellow, but he might be able to help you." Jack thanked them and set off toward the neighboring town. The journey took him another few days, but he was determined. When he finally arrived, he found the man they had spoken of. A grizzled old man with a thick white beard who ran a small office out of a run-down building. He introduced himself as Walter and seemed surprised to see Jack. "What can I do for you, young fella?" Walter asked, squinting at him through his thick spectacles. Jack didn't waste any time. "I'm here about the ranch you have for sale," he said. "I've heard about it, and I'm interested in buying it." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Well, I'm surprised someone's interested. Not many folks want to deal with that piece of land. It's rough country. But if you've got the money, I'm sure we can work something out." Jack nodded. He had been saving for months, doing odd jobs here and there, and he had managed to scrape together the $50 the ranch supposedly cost. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. Walter took the money without hesitation. He didn't seem to care much about the price. It was more of a formality for him. After a quick discussion, Jack signed the papers, and just like that, he owned the ranch. Walter handed him the deed, a simple piece of paper that seemed almost too fragile to be real. Jack couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of excitement and uncertainty. This was his land now, for better or worse. The deal was done, and Jack wasted no time. He gathered his things and set off to find his new home. The journey was long, and the land was far more remote than he had imagined. As he rode across the endless stretches of desert, he couldn't help but wonder what kind of life awaited him. He had heard stories about the dangers of the desert, about the wild animals and unpredictable weather. But for Jack, there was something freeing about it all. The idea of having his own place, a place where he could make his own rules, filled him with hope. Finally, after several days of travel, Jack arrived at the ranch. As he stood at the edge of the land, looking out over the barren landscape, he realized that he had no idea what he was getting into. The land was dry and cracked. The buildings were old and falling apart, and the air felt thick with silence. It was a far cry from the bustling towns he had grown used to, but it was his. It was his chance to start fresh. As he set up camp for the night, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this place than he realized. The wind howled across the open land, and in the distance he thought he saw movement. But when he looked again, it was gone. For now, though, Jack didn't have the energy to worry about it. Tomorrow he would explore the land further, figure out how to make it work. But little did Jack know, the real surprises were just beginning. The sun had just begun to set as Jack Thompson rode across the endless desert, his horse Dusty carrying him over the rugged terrain. The silence around him was thick, broken only by the soft sound of the horse's hooves striking the hard ground. For Jack, this moment felt like both an end and a beginning. He had left behind the noisy, busy towns, the places filled with people he would never know. And now he was on his way to something that could be his very own land, his own future. It had been days since Jack had signed the papers for the ranch, and although he was excited, there was also a part of him that felt unsure. The journey across the desert was harsh, the air was dry, and the heat of the day seemed to seep into his very bones. Even as the sun began to set behind the distant mountains, Jack could feel the weight of the land ahead of him, both physically and emotionally. He had heard stories about the deserts of the Southwest, stories about how unforgiving they could be, and now he was about to experience it firsthand. Jack's only company on this long journey was his trusty horse, Dusty, and the occasional wild animal he would see darting across the sand or flying high above. But it wasn't just the heat that made Jack uneasy. It was the isolation. Out here, there was no one to help him if things went wrong, no town to run to for supplies or shelter. This was the real wilderness, and it felt both thrilling and terrifying at the same time. As night began to fall, Jack set up camp by a small dry creek bed. He had a simple campfire and the few belongings he had brought along. There was no food to speak of, only what little jerky and water he had left, but he wasn't too concerned. He had learned how to survive in tough conditions, having spent many nights on the trail with nothing but the stars overhead and the wind as his companion. The fire crackled softly as Jack stared into the flames, his thoughts drifting. He thought about what he had left behind. The long, tiring cattle drives, the endless moving from place to place, the loneliness that had followed him everywhere. He thought about the ranch, about the possibilities it held. Maybe this was the chance he had been waiting for. Maybe he could make something of the land, build a life that would be different from everything that had come before. But the doubts lingered too. He had no experience with running a ranch, and the land was far from fertile. He wasn't sure if he even knew how to begin. The next morning, Jack woke early, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. He packed his things, saddled Dusty, and set off again. The desert was starting to look more familiar now, its brown hills and vast stretches of nothingness becoming less intimidating and more routine. Jack was getting closer to his new home, but still, a sense of uncertainty gnawed at him. The ranch was far from the perfect picture of a place to settle. It was raw, wild land with few resources to speak of. But the thought of owning something that was his, something that could finally give him a sense of purpose, kept him going. As the hours passed, the desert began to change. The sand gave way to rocky hills and sparse, scrubby trees that grew along the edges of dry riverbeds. Jack could see distant peaks in the distance, their outlines sharp against the clear blue sky. It was a beautiful sight, but there was no denying the harshness of the environment. The landscape was tough, and it was clear that this land would require someone with both strength and patience to make it work. By midday, Jack stopped for a break, giving Dusty a chance to drink from a small water hole he had found. He removed his hat and wiped the sweat from his brow. The sun was high now, and the heat was unbearable. Jack was used to it, but even he could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. He took a deep breath, feeling the dry air burn in his chest, and looked around at the desolate land. Not much to look at, he muttered to himself, but he knew that there was something more to this place. There had to be. After all, he had bought it for a reason. Jack pushed on, knowing that every mile brought him closer to his goal. He had little choice but to keep going. He had made a promise to himself when he first left home. to find something worth staying for, a place to call his own. And even though he wasn't sure if this ranch was the right place, it was the only place he had. The hope of something better, something lasting, kept him moving forward. Late in the afternoon, Jack finally saw something in the distance. It wasn't much at first, just a faint outline of buildings against the horizon. But it was enough to give him a renewed sense of energy. His heart quickened as he pushed Dusty harder, eager to reach his new home. As he got closer, he could see the crumbling structures more clearly. The buildings were old, weathered by time and the harsh desert winds. The barn, though standing, looked like it hadn't been used in years, its wooden boards faded and splintered. The house was small, with a sagging roof and cracked windows. Jack dismounted and walked slowly around the property, inspecting every corner. The land was vast, stretching far beyond the buildings, but it was clear that the place hadn't been cared for in a long time. The soil was dry, cracked, and the few trees that dotted the landscape looked as though they were barely hanging on. There was no sign of any livestock, no crops growing in the fields, nothing but the desolate remains of a place once thriving. Jack felt a pang of doubt. What had he gotten himself into? The reality of the land seemed so different from what he had imagined. This wasn't a place for a new beginning. It felt like a place for endings. But he couldn't turn back. The deed was in his pocket, the papers signed, and his money spent. This was his land now, and Jack Thompson wasn't the type of man to give up so easily. As night began to fall, Jack set up camp near the barn, unsure of what the future held but determined to face it. The desert around him seemed even more vast and silent now, the only sound the wind rustling through the dry grass. Jack looked up at the stars, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him. There was no going back now, only forward. Tomorrow he would start. He would make this land his own, no matter how tough it would be. He had no idea what lay ahead, but Jack Thompson wasn't the kind of man to run from a challenge. He was here for a reason, and he would face whatever came his way with the same grit that had gotten him this far. And as the desert night embraced him in its cool, quiet darkness, Jack knew that the real journey was only just beginning. The next morning, Jack awoke early to the sharp light of dawn breaking across the dry desert landscape. The air was cooler than it had been during the heat of the day, and the sky, painted in shades of pink and orange, promised another sweltering afternoon. As Jack rubbed his tired eyes, he felt the weight of the land around him. It was still early, and the place felt silent, as if it were waiting for something to happen. But Jack wasn't sure what that something was, or if anything at all would change. He sat up slowly, stretching his stiff limbs. Dusty, his faithful horse, was grazing nearby, his head down and his tail swishing lazily in the morning breeze. Jack watched the horse for a moment, feeling a sense of calm that he hadn't felt in days. He was alone here, yes, but there was something about the solitude that brought him a strange peace. Maybe it was the promise of owning land. Maybe it was the quiet. Or maybe it was just the fact that he was far away from everything he used to know. After packing up his camp and saddling Dusty, Jack decided to explore the area a little more. He had only seen parts of the ranch the day before, and the sense of isolation had kept him from venturing too far. Today, however, he was determined to find out more about the land he had bought. He needed to know what he was working with if he was going to make this place his home. Jack spent the morning walking around the property, inspecting the barn and the old house, checking out the nearby creek for water, and looking at the dry fields that stretched out into the horizon. He was trying to make sense of it all, what he could use, what he could repair, and what he'd have to leave behind. But as he stood by the creek, looking down at the water, he suddenly felt like something was off. He had heard stories about the desert, about the hidden dangers and the things that could creep up on a man when he least expected it. Maybe it was just his imagination, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was nearby. He squinted into the distance, but the land was still. There were no animals, no sounds. The air was so still that it felt like the world had stopped moving. But then, just as Jack was about to dismiss the feeling, he heard something. A soft rustling sound from the other side of the creek. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He froze, straining his ears to listen. The sound came again, this time clearer. A soft splash of water like something moving through it, moving through. His first instinct was to draw his rifle, but he quickly stopped himself. He didn't want to make any noise, not yet. Instead, he crept carefully toward the sound, moving quietly through the brush. When he finally reached the creek, he crouched down behind a large rock and peered over the top. His eyes widened in surprise as he saw 3 young women bathing in the cool, clear water. They were laughing softly to each other, their dark hair flowing around their shoulders, and the water shimmered as it splashed against their skin. Jack couldn't believe his eyes. These weren't settlers, but Apache women. He could tell by their appearance, their clothing, and the way they moved. For a long moment, Jack just stood there, his breath caught in his throat. He had never seen Apache women this close before, and their beauty struck him in ways he couldn't explain. The way they moved so naturally, so gracefully, made Jack feel like an intruder. He didn't know what to do, how to act in this unexpected moment. Just as he was about to turn away, one of the girls looked up. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Jack's heart raced as he slowly lifted his hand in a gesture of apology, but the girl didn't seem alarmed. Instead, she just smiled softly, a look of calmness in her eyes. The others didn't notice Jack at first, but when the girl spoke to them in a low voice, they turned around. When they saw Jack, their smiles faded, and they quickly moved to cover themselves. Jack, feeling embarrassed and unsure of what to do, quickly looked away and took a few steps back. He knew he had to leave, but he didn't want to seem rude or disrespectful. The Apache people were known for their strong sense of pride, and Jack didn't want to offend them, especially not after coming all this way. He cleared his throat and called out in a soft voice, "I didn't mean to intrude. I'm sorry." The girl he had first seen raised her hand, signaling for him to wait. She spoke in a language Jack didn't understand, but her tone was calm. After a moment, she said something in broken English. "It's fine. You're not the first. But this is our land, too." Jack swallowed hard, trying to understand what she meant. "I didn't know," he replied. "I'm just passing through. I bought the ranch not far from here. I didn't mean to disturb you." The girl nodded slowly. "You bought it, but the land is ours too. We live here." Jack stood frozen, unsure of what to say next. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she had just told him. Could it be possible? Had he unknowingly purchased land that wasn't his to own? The girl's expression softened, and she stood up from the water, gesturing for Jack to come closer. "My name is Hassan," she said. "This is my family's land. But we don't live like other people. We live in the desert, away from the towns." Jack felt his stomach drop. He had no idea what to make of this. He had heard rumors of Apache, tribes in the area, but he hadn't expected to encounter any so soon, and certainly not like this, alone in the desert with no one else around. "I didn't know," Jack said, his voice quieter now. "I didn't mean to trespass." Hassan smiled, and there was a calmness in her eyes that reassured Jack. "You didn't trespass. But you should understand. We've lived here for many years. This land is part of us. The ranch. It was once ours." Jack's mind spun. This was more than he had expected. His purchase of the ranch was turning out to be far more complicated than he could have imagined. "I'm sorry," Jack said again, unsure of how to handle the situation. "I'll leave if you want me to. I didn't know." Hassan held up a hand, stopping him. "No, you don't have to leave. But you should know that you're not alone out here. We've been here for generations, and we will not leave." Jack nodded, trying to take it all in. There was so much more to this land, to this place, than he had understood. He wasn't just dealing with an old ranch. He was standing on sacred ground, with people who had a deep connection to it. The 3 girls, Hassan and her 2 younger sisters, began to gather their things, preparing to leave the creek. Hassan turned to Jack before she left. "We'll meet again," she said softly. "But next time, you will know more." Jack stood still as they walked away, his thoughts swirling with questions. There was so much he didn't understand, so much he needed to learn. But for now, he knew one thing. This place, this land, was far more than a simple ranch. It was a part of something much bigger, something Jack was only beginning to realize. I sat alone by the crackling campfire that night, the stars shining brightly above him in the vast desert sky. The evening air was cool, but the events of the day had left him feeling uneasy. He had learned something that he hadn't expected, a truth that shifted everything he thought he knew about the ranch and the land he had bought. After meeting Hassan and her sisters by the creek, Jack felt a deep sense of confusion. The Apache girls had been kind, yet there was something undeniably serious in their words. The land was not just a piece of property to them. It was their home, their heritage. The history of the place ran deeper than Jack could have ever imagined. This was not just some empty, abandoned ranch that he had stumbled upon. It was part of a much larger story, one that Jack had unknowingly walked right into. The fire flickered in front of him as Jack thought back to Hassan's words. She had told him that this land had once belonged to her people, that it was sacred ground. He could still see the calm look in her eyes, the way she spoke with quiet authority. It was clear that she wasn't angry with him, but there was something else in her expression, a quiet, unspoken weight. She hadn't demanded that he leave, but she had made it clear that the ranch was more than just land to them. It was a place of deep cultural significance, a part of their very identity. Jack's thoughts drifted back to the time when he had first heard about the ranch. The price was so low, $50, it seemed too good to be true. But now, sitting there in the darkness, he wondered if it really had been a bargain. What had happened to the Apache people? Why had they left? How could he, a man looking for a fresh start, have ended up buying something that wasn't truly his to own? The fire crackled as Jack poked at the embers, lost in his thoughts. He had come to this land looking for something to call his own, but now he found himself caught in a web of history and culture that he hadn't anticipated. He had no intention of causing harm, but the reality was clear. The Apache people had a right to this land, just as much as he did. Maybe even more so. Just as Jack's mind began to spiral, he heard a sound, a soft footstep in the sand. He turned quickly, his heart beating faster, and saw Hassan standing at the edge of the campfire's glow. She wasn't alone. Behind her were her two sisters, their faces lit only by the soft light of the fire. Hassan stepped forward, her calm presence easing some of Jack's anxiety. She gave him a small nod, signaling that it was okay. Jack stood unsure of how to greet them, but Hassan spoke before he could say anything. "We didn't mean to frighten you earlier," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But we wanted you to know the truth." Jack nodded. I didn't know," he said quietly. "I didn't know any of this. I didn't mean to take something that wasn't mine." Hassan's gaze softened. "You did not know, and we do not blame you for that. But the land belongs to us, and we have not forgotten it. My people were forced to leave many years ago, but we have always kept a place for ourselves here, waiting for the day when we could return." Jack's chest tightened. The weight of her words sank deep into him. It was more than just land. It was a piece of their identity, their culture, and their history. He felt a mix of guilt and understanding, but also a growing sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about ownership, it was about respect. Hassan continued, her voice steady. "When the settlers came, they took the land. They drove my people from it. Many of us were forced to leave our homes and wander in search of a new place to live, but the land remained in our hearts. We knew we would return." Jack couldn't help but feel a deep sadness at her words. He had always heard of the struggles the Native American tribes had faced, but he had never thought about it in such personal terms. He had been a cowboy for most of his life, always moving from place to place, never fully understanding the history of the land he traveled. He had always seen the desert as an empty space, a place where one could go to start fresh. But now, standing here in the midst of Hassan and her family, he realized how wrong he had been. "The land," Hassan continued, "is sacred to us. It holds our stories, our ancestors, and the spirits of our people. It is a part of who we are. You may have bought it, but you must understand, it was never meant to be sold." Jack stood silently, unsure of what to say. He had no right to argue with her. He had no right to question the history that had shaped this land, no right to ignore the connection that Hassan and her people had to it. His mind raced with thoughts of how to resolve this. He couldn't just ignore them. But what could he do? He had already spent his savings on the ranch. It wasn't like he could just leave, especially after everything he had been through to get here. I don't know what to do," Jack said, his voice low. "I've got no family, no place to go. I thought this was a chance for me to have something of my own. I never thought about the past. I never thought about what this land really meant. Hassan nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Jack's. I understand, she said softly. This place is not just for us to return to, it is also a place for new beginnings. But we must respect the past in order to move forward. We do not want to chase you away, but we want you to understand the truth of this land. Jack looked at her, his heart heavy with the burden of the situation. He had never thought about history in such personal terms before. It wasn't just about finding a place to live, it was about understanding where you were, what had happened before you, and who came before you. He realized that he had a choice now. He could continue on as if nothing had happened, ignoring the past and forging ahead with his plans, or he could face the truth and try to make things right. I don't want to cause trouble, Jack said quietly, his eyes meeting Hassan's. I'll do whatever I can to make this right. I don't know how yet, but I'll figure it out. Hassan's expression softened even further and she nodded. You don't have to decide everything now. But you must understand that you are not alone here. You are not the only one with a claim to this land. Jack felt a weight lift from his shoulders even though he still didn't know what his next step should be. Hassan and her sisters didn't want to fight. They didn't want to chase him away. But they needed him to understand that this was their home, their land, and their heritage. I'll stay, Jack said finally. But I'll do things differently. I'll learn. I'll work with you, not against you. I'll figure out how to share this land. Hassan smiled, the first real smile Jack had seen since their meeting by the creek. That is all we ask, she said. Now let us show you how to live with the land. We will help you. Jack felt a deep sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be what he had imagined when he first bought the ranch. But it was a start. It was a new chapter in his life, and this time he wasn't alone. Days passed, and Jack Thompson found himself caught in a world he had never imagined. What had started as a dream to own land and live a quiet life was turning into something far more complex. The land he had purchased, an isolated stretch of desert, was not just any piece of property. It was part of a history that Jack had never considered. The Apache people, led by Hassan and her family, had lived here long before him. The land had belonged to their ancestors, and they still saw it as their home. At first, Jack had been overwhelmed. He hadn't intended to buy land that wasn't fully his to claim, but he couldn't ignore the fact that it was now his responsibility to navigate this delicate situation. He had come looking for a fresh start, but now he realized it wasn't just about starting over for him. It was about finding a way to share this land, to respect its history, and to make peace with the Apache family who had lived there long before him. Hassan and her sisters had left the camp the day after their meeting by the creek. They hadn't demanded Jack leave, but they had made it clear that this land was sacred to them. Jack had agreed to think it over, to try and find a way to balance his ownership with their rightful connection to the place. He spent days walking around the ranch thinking deeply about the choices before him. The landscape stretched endlessly before him, desolate, raw, and wild, but Jack found something beautiful in it now, something he hadn't seen before. The desert was no longer just an empty, barren place. He could see the history in the wind that rustled through the dry grass and the cracked earth beneath his feet, and in the quiet strength of the mountains on the horizon. But the more Jack thought about it, the more he realized that the land belonged to both him and the Apache people. He couldn't just pretend that everything was fine or act as if the past didn't matter. One evening, after a long day of work, Jack decided to visit Hassan again. He had made up his mind and he needed to speak with her. He wanted to do the right thing, but he wasn't sure what the right thing was yet. He saddled up Dusty and rode toward the creek where he had first met the Apache family. As he approached the creek, Jack saw Hassan sitting near the water, her long black hair flowing in the breeze. Her sisters were nearby, tending to a small fire. Jack dismounted and walked over to them, feeling the weight of his decision in every step. Hassan looked up when she heard him approach, and a small smile tugged at her lips. She stood and motioned for him to sit. You came back, Hassan said softly. I did, Jack replied, sitting down beside her. I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About the land. About everything. Hassan nodded but said nothing, waiting for Jack to continue. I came out here looking for a fresh start, but I didn't understand what this land really meant, Jack said, his voice slow but steady. I didn't know it was so much more than just a place to live. I didn't know it was so deeply tied to your people's history. He paused, searching for the right words. I don't want to take anything that isn't mine. I don't want to be disrespectful, or to make things harder for you and your family. But I also can't just walk away from it. This place, this land, it means something to me now too. I've been working it, getting to know it, and it feels like it's part of me now. Asan listened quietly, her expression calm. When Jack finished speaking, she turned to her sisters who had been listening from across the fire. They exchanged a few quiet words before Asan looked back at Jack. You are right, she said. The land is part of us, part of our history, but we can share it. We don't need to fight over it. There is a way for you to stay here and for us to stay here too. Jack's heart lifted. He hadn't expected this kind of response. He had feared that Asan and her family might want him to leave, that they would demand the land back. But now it seemed like there was hope for a peaceful resolution. I don't want to take it all from you, Jack said earnestly. I just want to live here to work the land. I'm not asking for everything. I'm asking to share it, to make it a place where we can both have what we need. Asan nodded slowly, a thoughtful look on her face. We can work together. You can stay here, but we will teach you how to live with the land, how to understand its rhythms and its ways. We will show you the old ways of the Apache, and you will show us how you live. Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him. This was it. The opportunity to build something meaningful, to work with the Apache people, not against them. He would stay, but he would stay with respect and understanding. They would learn from each other, and together they would make this land a place of shared life and purpose. For weeks after that conversation, Jack worked with Asan and her sisters. They taught him how to hunt the desert animals, how to find food and water in places he never thought to look, and how to understand the subtle shifts in the weather. He learned about the deep connection the Apache had to the land, their belief that the earth, the sky, and the animals were all connected in a delicate balance. Jack had always been a cowboy, but now he was learning to live with the land, not just on it. In return, Jack showed them how to care for the old buildings, how to fix the barn, and how to make the land more productive. They didn't always agree on everything. There were moments when their different ways of life clashed, but over time they built a kind of understanding and partnership. Asan and her family helped Jack understand what it meant to be part of something larger than himself, and Jack helped them adapt to a changing world. The land slowly began to come to life again. The dry fields were planted with crops, and the barn became a place of work and shelter. Jack knew that he would never fully own the land, not in the way he had once hoped, but he also knew that owning it didn't matter as much as living on it in harmony with those who had come before him. Months passed, and the desert began to bloom in its own quiet way. Jack no longer felt like an outsider. He had found something more meaningful than land or possessions. He had found a community, a purpose, and a sense of belonging. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Jack sat outside the house, watching the last rays of light fade over the mountains. Asan and her sisters sat nearby talking quietly. Jack realized that this was his home now, not because he owned it, but because he had worked for it, alongside the Apache family that had shown him what it meant to live with the land. The choice had been difficult, but in the end, it was the right one. Jack had chosen to share the land, to respect its history and its people, and in doing so he had found a new life, one that was richer and fuller than he could have ever imagined when he first set out on his journey. The desert had become more than just a place for him. It had become a place of understanding, a place where past and present met, where different cultures could come together and find a way to live in harmony. Jack knew that the future wasn't clear, but for the first time, he felt at peace with the choices he had made. And in that quiet moment, with the stars above and the land stretched out before him, Jack Thompson knew he had found what he had been searching for all along,